Can you hear me, Fiona? Hello.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me? Hello?
You're back.
I'm back. Brilliant. Wonderful. Welcome to the Menopause Masterminds for the Menopause Research and Education Fund. You are a veteran of the menopause world. You're the past president of the International Menopause Society, the Australasian Menopause Society, an honorary life member of both, an obstetrician and gynaecologist who's running a menopause and menstrual disorders service at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, and a professor of clinical obstetrics and gynaecology at the University of Sydney. You have published more than 140 research papers and have been cited. Did you know that you've been cited in more than 4,657 other papers? That's quite an achievement. It's quite, yeah, there you go, ResearchGate, it tells you a lot. Now, you are also the immediate past president of the International Menopause Society's journal Climacteric, and you've just left it at a very interesting time. Your successor has written Strap In and Enjoy the Ride in his first editorial, the lovely Tim Hillard. But now you're sort of stepping out. Now, one of the biggest challenges you would have faced and he now has to face is how you keep up with the very fast-paced dialogue that goes on in social media that works at such a much quicker pace than academia can. How do you challenge that? How do you work with it?
Well, it's frankly impossible, Fiona, for a journal, a medical journal, whether it's a hard copy journal or an online journal, the processes which we go through, peer review and so on, to ensure that the article we publish is the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, means that we have a lag time between when we receive papers and when they get published. So that is why, of course, the International Menopause Society and the Australasian Menopause Society now have quite a strong online presence via webinars and podcasts and chat sessions as well. It's the only way we can effectively keep up, not so much with other published literature, but with all the stuff that happens in social media in particular.
Yeah, and speaking of published literature, we have at the moment a quite polemic environment, and we've just had the series of opinion pieces published in The Lancet. You and the very lovely Susan Davis wrote quite a strong rebuttal to that. How does that affect when clinicians see these kinds of sort of polarizations? How does it affect them? You've got one side saying that menopause and HRT has been over medicalized, and the other side saying, but hang on a second, we've got all of these women over here who've got significant issues. If you're a clinician sitting in the middle of that, how does that affect you?
Oh, I think it's very difficult for clinicians. The data which was published in that set of articles in The Lancet was, broadly speaking, nothing new. And much of what was said in those articles was consistent with what we all believe to be the appropriate approach. Where we differed was the suggestion that empowerment women meant essentially telling them that the menopause was a normal process and get on with it. Now, if colleague Professor Hickey were here now, she would disagree with me again, but that's certainly how a lot of people interpreted it, and it was unfortunate that that was the case. Empowerment for me means providing broad-based education for all women, particularly in midlife women, so that they understand exactly what is happening to them and they understand what options are available to them for treatment or for non-treatment. And that, I think, is where we differed most profoundly. It's very, very hard for clinicians out there in the world. You know, I spend a good part of my week reading papers, but if you're hard at it at Coalface, you don't have the time to do that, nor do you have access to all the papers, even if you had the time. So it's very difficult for clinicians. We just have to try and give them up-to-date information as much as possible, as you mentioned in the previous question.
Yeah, but it's a very, very difficult one. And it leaves women, of course, in a very confused situation as well, because they've got one size. Yeah. I mean, do you think perhaps that they did have a point in some way in saying that, you know, the role of lifestyle isn't argued as vociferously as it could possibly be?
Well, no, I don't agree with that, because the current International Menopause Society guidelines and the current global consensus statement on the use of hormone therapy says that the principal indication to use menopausal hormone therapy is to alleviate symptoms. It goes on to say there are some other potential benefits, but it then says when hormones are used, it should be part of an overall strategy to improve the health and lifestyle of women going through midlife change. So we've always advocated. I mean, I think if you went back to the 1990s, I can remember, I think the philosophy then was somebody became menopausal, a period stopped, she went to the GP, said, I haven't had a period for a year. And GP said, well, you've got to take hormones. I agree with that and haven't agreed with that for decades. You know, we think hormones are great, but they should be used in the right circumstances. And obviously for women, even for those women, we should be talking about lifestyle measures, diet, exercise, weight, consumption of alcohol, cigarettes, other drugs, and so on.
Yeah, yeah. Is there much of this, do you think? I mean, the WHI, the Women's Health Initiative study that came out in the early 2000s that basically saw people flushing their HRT down the loo. How much of a hangover is there from that today when we see things? The studies that keep on coming out always seem to refer back to these findings. The headlines are still quite scary. Is that part of the reason why we have this polarized view as well, do you think?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a throwback to all of that. When WHI was first released, it was done so in a very dramatic manner, and it did scare a lot of women, and it scared a lot of doctors. And some just washed their hand, walked away and said, that's it. I don't need to treat menopausal women, and I never will again. And despite the fact that the WHI investigators have republished data over and over again, including last week, reviewing the literature and having a much more measured approach to everything, those people who walked away haven't come back. And by and large, when we conduct education sessions for doctors, we preach to the converted. The people who walked away aren't interested, so they don't listen to us, they don't listen to anyone really, and they don't come to conferences at which these topics are discussed. And that's what we have to break down. And you mentioned a bit about possibly over-prescribing. If you look at Western data, then 80% of women have menopausal symptoms of some sort, as hot flushes, let's say, as they go through the menopause transition. About a third of them, so about 20% of all women, experience symptoms which are moderate to severe, which means they interfere with their daily activities and they interfere with their sleep. So, okay, so 25% of women have trouble that interferes with their life, but in Australia, about 13% of women use hormones. In the UK, I've got a feeling it's about 15 or 16%. In the US, much the same. So we are actually not giving hormones to as many women who need them. And of course, sometimes that's because women don't take them, and that's their choice too. But we're certainly not, in my view, over-prescribing.
In terms of that, I mean, you mentioned there were severe symptoms, but I had a woman yesterday saying, my GP told me I couldn't have HRT because my symptoms weren't severe enough. Should it only be restricted to people who have severe symptoms, or is that, how do you decide?
Not at all. I mean, that's a bit silly, really. It's like saying to somebody, you've only got mild diabetes, so you don't need any treatment. Somebody has symptoms and seeks assistance for those, what the doctor should do is say, there are lifestyle things you can do. This is a normal physiological process. We don't know how long it will last or if it will go away, but for most women it will go away in about 7 years or so. But if you are seeking treatment options, these are the things that we can offer you. And you don't have to start with hormones. If you don't like hormones, you can have them at the bottom of your list. But to be fair to your patient and honest to yourself, you should be telling women all the choices that are available.
Yeah. The other thing, because you mentioned the new WHI data that came out a few days back, is there also a confusion then for clinicians, the press, and everybody when they say, for example, in this one, it doesn't support the use of HRT for the prevention of heart disease, but it's looking at old forms of HRT that most of us don't use anymore. So how relevant is this, and does this also add to that confusion around HRT?
Well, it's incredibly relevant. The data that they're referring to, certainly in WHI's case, does not really support HRT for cardiovascular disease, but they were using oral estrogen and a synthetic progesterone. And we know full well, and did at the time, that oral estrogen alone will certainly increase thromboembolic risk, which is cardiovascular disease. And synthetic progestogens, because they bind to hormone receptors other than just progesterone receptors, can also have adverse effects on cardiovascular health and also on breast health. So what we know from WHI is a lot about what happened to a cohort of American women who took oral conjugated estrogens and oral medroxyprogesterone acetate. That's all.
But then often the headline is going to be translated saying HRT is not what won't help for, as if there'll be a blanket carpet approach to the response to it. Is there a responsibility then on researchers' behalf to make sure that people really understand what it is they've actually looked at? Because it gets lost in translation.
Yeah, it's lost in translation. If you read papers, they say in their methods section, they describe exactly what they did, how old the women were, what their comorbidities were, and exactly what they took. But that's not what the headline writers see. And you can never be quite sure what the headline writers are going to say. You know, after that recent WHI paper, I saw a Washington Post report that said, researchers say hormones are not as harmful as was once thought. So that's, I mean, it's damned with faint praise, but what I mean, and I can remember some years ago, a long time ago, when the data from the second arm of Women's Health Initiative came out, which was estrogen only, and it showed cardiovascular benefit and it showed no increased risk of breast cancer. And we, the IMS board, thought, oh, well, nobody will take any notice of this because it's good news. But the media did take notice of that because they wanted to tell the story about the researchers not telling the truth the first time. So it's ridiculous.
You can't win. Yeah.
It's very hard. It's very hard. And it's, look, you know, you and I are the same as all the people looking and listening to this. We don't have all the time in the day to read all this stuff. So we put the paper or the computer or whatever in the morning, look at the television and get the headlines. And that's it. We don't do a deep dive really. But
No.
Unfortunately, sometimes you need to.
Yeah. I think that does, you know, being a journalist myself, I think there needs to be a bit of education for journalists on how to read studies and what the things that are important to pick out and what it is that they're actually looking at is probably an important thing to learn.
I think it's pretty hard, I think.
Very. If at the moment a lot of this polarization, I wonder, is it driven because there's, you know, been quite a big push on estrogen's fantastic. It's going to solve all of your problems. You can take a lot of estrogen. You can virtually bathe in estrogen. How much of this do you think has sort of added to this sort of polarized society? And Are there cases where it's justified for people to have much more than a higher than recommended dose? Should people really be worried about the amount of estrogen that they're using, or is it a storm in a teacup?
No, it's not a storm in a teacup. We always say you should use the dose of estrogen which will alleviate your symptom or which is appropriate to treat the condition for which it's being prescribed. And for most women, that will be the sort of doses of hormones which are commonly used, which, by the way, are generally speaking lower doses than we used 20 years ago. Some women do require more to alleviate their symptoms, but the problem is we don't have any reliable data on what those very high doses will do in terms of harm. We haven't got any doubt that in some ways they'll be good. Of course, if your flushes don't go away until you take a bucket load of estrogen, I understand why you're doing that. But if what we don't know is if you do that, how many other risks have you increased? For example, transdermal estrogen is generally regarded as having no effect on the risk of thromboembolic disease. But we're talking about standard doses. And when you use very high doses, there are questions to suggest it might be harmful, but there's really no good data.
Yeah, this is why we need more research, isn't it? You'll never be retiring. The other
Look,
thing
it's very hard. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. It is very hard because I understand why the enthusiasts are using higher doses, but they just have to think about it. Every time you must pause and say, am I really doing this patient good or not? And how do I know?
Time will tell. The other thing that the other couple of studies that have come out in the last week or so that are of interest to people are the ones that look at, I think there's one from Argentina that's looking at potential cognitive benefits, and the other one was in the use of HRT in people over the age of 65, showing that perhaps it wasn't such a bad thing to be using if you were keeping on going. How much comfort can we take from those kinds of studies?
I think they're both very interesting. I think the study looking at cognitive benefit is not the first, and we know from work done, again, 20 years ago, that there are very plausible mechanisms by which we would expect estrogen to have positive effects on cognitive health and on the health of the brain in many different ways. The trouble is teasing out confounders which do make it very difficult for us to really assess what is going on in terms of cognitive health. And we need to remember cognitive health is not one thing. It's a whole mismatch of a lot of different conditions. It's not all Alzheimer's and it's not all vascular and it's a bit of this and a bit of that. But I do think it's encouraging. And I think the reason I'm encouraged about that one particularly is that we do know that there are plausible mechanisms to explain the suggestion that it would work. In terms of women older than 65 using estrogens, if you have started hormone therapy when you were 50, 51, 52, when you're going through the menopause and having your last period, then I think the evidence is very clear that if women persist with that, they will in fact overall continue to have benefits. It could be argued, if you're using synthetic progestogens, that long-term use could be associated with slightly increased risk of getting breast cancer, but not of dying of it. But on the other hand, it'll alleviate symptoms, it'll be good for the brain, it'll be good for cardiovascular health, and it'll be good for bone health. And that's very clear. The question is, can you initiate therapy in women who are older, who have never needed hormones until they were 65? So there's two issues there. One is most women who go through the menopause at 50 shouldn't be getting hot flushes for the first time at 65. So you certainly need to figure out whether there's another underlying cause for those flushes. And the other is, as we get older, we know that women's cardiovascular health is protected before the menopause. Endogenous estrogen protects them. They have less risk of heart disease than men, but we know they try to catch up after the menopause. And so there's a great risk that they'll have atherosclerotic plaques in their major vessels by the time they get to 65. Therefore, if they take oral estrogen, they're at increased risk of a blood clot. But it doesn't mean every woman over the age of 65 cannot have estrogen at all. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. You mentioned cognition there, and the other thing that's very interesting and a quite a significant debate is testosterone. And at the moment here in the UK, it's off license only for libido. I understand that Susan Davis in Australia is doing pretty amazing studies on testosterone and trying to get ones going to see the link with cognition, because we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. Where do we see this going?
It's a very interesting field, because testosterone is the precursor of estrogen. And so we know, for example, that all the estrogen a woman has in her body is made initially from testosterone in the premenopausal years in the ovaries, and postmenopausally from DHEA in the adrenal glands, and which is then converted into testosterone and finally into estrogen. We also know there are receptors for testosterone all over the body. For example, in the vagina and vaginal mucosa, in the musculature, and so on, and in nerves that can be generated from those sites. And so testosterone obviously can have a significant effect on sexual function for all sorts of reasons, partly because it's converted to estrogen and therefore stops dryness, partly because it has an effect of its own on libido, but also because it has these secondary effects on other tissues. So I do think the work Susan Davis is doing is very, very exciting. And we hope we'll have a bit of data from that by the end of the year. At the moment, the reason we say it's only for use for the treatment of hypoactive sexual desire disorder in postmenopausal women is that's the only data we have solid evidence for. But I think the future is very exciting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it makes people so angry because, you know, there's so much. I feel so much better. I've got so much more energy, and it's sort of, why won't you to everybody? So it does it, but you know, it needs it. Also, we need to know, I guess, what the long-term heart implications are and things like that for it. Don't we?
Well, we do, and again, if you talk about doses, you know, we know that the physiological doses that we use for HSDD in postmenopausal women don't have cardiovascular effects, but we don't know again what higher doses would do. So I really, people will say I'm a boring old man that wants everybody to suffer. I just don't want anyone to be harmed.
Which is very important. Now, there's often, speaking of postmenopausal women, it's often said that menopausal symptoms, you know, fade out within, you know, 4 to 7 years, and, you know, a very rare number of women will continue on to have symptoms into their 70s or 80s. But normally, then, we're talking about vasomotor symptoms. Have we been too myopic in the way we look at symptoms? Because it does appear that bladder symptoms go on, vaginal symptoms go on, mood symptoms go on. We still can't sleep. Should that definition of postmenopausal symptoms be revised?
Well, my definition of postmenopause is that it starts 1 year after your last period and it goes on for the rest of your life. And I think people need to understand that. We all talk about menopause, but it's just the date of your last period. And the time leading up to that is the perimenopause. And 1 year after your last period, you're postmenopausal for the rest of your life. And you're right, most women's symptoms, we believe, in Western communities last for about 7.5 years, but they can last a lot longer. And probably 10% of women have symptoms for the hot flushes, that is, or night sweats for the rest of their life. In terms of vaginal symptoms, they actually get worse as you get older. So untreated vaginal symptoms, GSM or VVA, if you like, not only persist, but get worse. Some of the brain fog stuff is peculiar to the perimenopausal changes because it's triggered by fluctuating hormone levels. But ultimate declines in estrogen, which is what happens, can also give rise to mood changes, which don't get better unless treated. And of course, the other examples, I guess, bone health and cardiovascular health.
Yeah. So it does. I think that mantra might need a little bit of revising.
Yeah. Well, That's exactly right. And I think going back to the very introduction when we were talking about empowerment women, we need them to understand that whilst this is a physiological process, the consequences of menopause are sometimes quite pathological. They won't be for all women, or not even for the majority of women, but they can be pathological and they can persist for a very long time.
Yeah. The US is doing some quite interesting things in terms of getting funding for menopause research and really making sure that their institutes that investigate and research menopause are allocating a certain amount of budget towards menopause research. Is that something that governments from around the world should actually take a look at and think of doing themselves?
They should. I mean, we think that there is a huge opportunity for governments here to invest in the research into the health of midlife women. And in so doing, they will ultimately save themselves a fortune in health costs, aging community, which is what we have in most parts of the world. Certainly in the Western world, we have an aging community. In Australia, we're getting some reasonable support from federal and state governments. In the state of New South Wales, where I live, the state government's committed $50 million over the next 4 years to assist in access to menopause services and in education of women and particularly family physicians. And there are similar models around my country, but the government will always tell you they have a budget and they have to identify key areas. And for us to attract their attention, we need women to lobby, really, because there are obviously pressing needs in terms of treatment for malignant disease and cardiovascular disease, which still 40% of us. But we certainly also need to look at the things we could do to improve midlife women's health and reduce the burden of those diseases aging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was looking at stats the other day from Japan, where we commonly hear this mantra as well of, Japanese people don't have menopause symptoms. But there was an estimate that was costing them $12 billion a year in absenteeism, women resigning from work and things like that. So apart from the health cost, there's an enormous economic cost. So they could actually save a lot of money.
There's a huge cost, absolutely huge.
Yeah. The other thing is, you mentioned education there. Given the doctor the other day saying that you can't have your HRT until because your symptoms aren't severe enough, you can't have systemic and topical HRT together. The list goes on and on and on. In terms of doctor education here in the UK, I can only speak for, I guess, there is no compulsory catch-up education for doctors. You said before that all doctors need to have at least some smattering of understanding of menopause. How do we get there? There's nothing there that says you actually have to catch up on this. How do we get that done? Because you're right, you said before you're preaching to the converted.
Well, I think we have to encourage the colleges which supervise continuing medical education for family doctors and for specialists to make sure that they include at least a component of the evaluation, which is completed every year, 2 years, 3 years, in all craft groups of medicine, to make sure that a component of that addresses the issues of midlife women's health. And not in isolation. And I'm not saying, do you know what a hormone is, or do you know what a hot flush is? I'm saying, did you know that women's cardiovascular health increases after the menopause? Did you know osteoporosis is much greater than in men? 1 woman in 3 after the age of 50 will have an osteoporotic fracture. Can you imagine what that's costing? And so we do need to train our doctors. And I think it is up to the professional colleges who oversee this to make sure that continuing medical education incorporates a component of midlife women's health.
Yeah, and actually that WHI study that we mentioned before, the reviewing of the data that was in JAMA a few days back, looked also at calcium and vitamin D supplements and hip fractures and other bone fractures, and found that it was only useful for hip fractures. Is that going to send a confusing message to people?
Yes, it'll probably tell people they don't need to take any calcium or vitamin D. and then they'll be worse off. What of course they're trying to say is that in isolation, these are useless endeavors. You have to have calcium, you have to have vitamin D, you have to have exercise, and if you are losing significant bone mass and density, then you do need to have at a certain point another intervention as well.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you may be out of the editorial hot seat, but you've said before that you are still working, and then with no signs of giving up yet, I assume.
No.
That you worry that you won't have enough time to get everything done by the time that you do think about retiring. What's left on your list that you want to make sure is done?
Fiona, I think for me, despite the X number of papers published, citations and all the rest of it, for me, the most important thing is education. And if I can do no more than educate my medical students and my gynae trainees and my colleagues, that'll be my main goal, to keep doing that for as long as I can, and spread the word as far as possible, and to encourage people to listen, to take heed, and to listen to their women. Listen to your 50-something-year-old woman when she comes in to see you. She's not old, and she has more than a third of her life still to go, and she deserves to have good evidence-based care provided to her by all of us. That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, we hear quite, consistently, women live longer than men. Women have got it good. This, that, we may well live longer, but nowadays it's really not all that much longer, and a lot of that is not in great health, and that needs to change.
Correct. Correct. It's
Absolutely.
not so much how many years you live, it's much more about how many years you live well.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I wish you all the luck in that, and if there's any way that the Menopause Research and Education Fund can help, let us know. So, Professor Rod Baber, we have come to the end of our Menopause Mastermind chat. Thank you so very much for joining us, and hopefully we shall speak again sometime in the future.
Thanks very much, Fiona. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.